Well, welcome once again, all my vintage dirt bike loving internet browsers, and thanks for coming back to check out more of those old motocrossers from back in the day, right here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV YouTube channel. Now, quite recently we've covered some really nice machines here on my Classic Dirt Bike TV channel, and many of them have been, it has to be said, immaculate and almost show-winning examples. So this time round we're going to feature what is essentially a no-nonsense, good old-fashioned down-to-earth race bike. So stay with me for the next few minutes as we take a look at David Loudon's 1982 KX420 Kawasaki. Now, Davey normally uses this old 1982 Kawasaki as his spare or standby bike should he encounter any mechanical problems with his number one race machine, which of course is his YZ490 Yamaha. Now, back in 1982, these KX420 Kawasaki's, it has to be said, were not Kawasaki's golden year with regards to building superb machines, as these old 420s were universally condemned as possibly one of Kawasaki's worst ever race bikes. Of course, one of the major problems riders had with these 82 KXs was the frames just seemed to snap at the slightest sniff of any kind of motocross track. Now, the 82 KX420 motor it wasn't the best engine that Kawasaki ever built. It was very, very short on power, fed by this Mikuni carburetor, of course, through a reed valve, and the engines were adequate to say the least, but they were certainly not Kawasaki's best ever motor. Now, a CDI electronic ignition on this bike with the 5-speed gearbox and the standard wet multi-plate clutch. Now, the engine casings, as I remember, were made of magnesium, and naturally that was to keep the overall weight of the bike down to the bare minimum. Now, they said at the time that this Kawasaki was made to take on the more successful Maiko, but in reality these 420s were overweight, the motors weren't the best, and the handling of the Kawasaki frame geometry was at best very questionable. Now, in 1982, many off-road motorcycling journalists absolutely slated this bike at the time, commenting that this 82 KX420 would very easily make the top 10 worst motocross machines of all time. It wasn't just one single thing that was wrong with this machine. It was a combination of the very weak frame, the gutless motor, and the overall suspension and handling characteristics. Plastic fuel tank once again on these KXs with these very hard to stick on graphics. Now, the front hubs were also made of magnesium, as I remember, on this machine. Now, this of course was the introduction of the famous Unitrack suspension on these 1982 bikes, but this allegedly innovative Unitrack suspension system that Kawasaki introduced in the early 1980s was hailed as the suspension system of the future. It had a vertical single rear shock with attached linkage onto the swing arm. It also had a separate pressurized nitrogen and oil remote reservoir. But in reality, this system wasn't much better than the old twin shock arrangement, although the potential was there to improve the system, and it wasn't long before other manufacturers were beginning to use single shock linkage suspension systems on their own machines. Now, this system was also called the bell crank system for obvious reasons. But one of the plus points on this 82 bike was this very comfortable KX seat. But the 82 KX in reality didn't have a lot going for it really in terms of being a high performing machine. It did have some half decent traits, but and good enough for your average club rider, but if you were really serious about your motocross, then this 82 KX wasn't the bike to have at the time. But then again, that is more than likely the reason that David has chosen this KX420 as his spare bike. You can just see just off shot there, Davey has a 465 and a YZ490 Yamaha, and he's very quick on both those Yamahas, but this of course is just basically a standby bike should anything happen to David's number one race machines. Now, once again, the front suspension on these KX Kawasaki's were adequate, but I don't think they were the best suspension systems on an open class motocross machine for 1982. Nevertheless, it's a very nice example of one of these KX420s from back in 1982. In fact, if you read some of the journalists' reports on this bike from that period, even Kawasaki thought that this wasn't their best machine, and didn't even go on to make a 500 of this bike in that same year. They were that disappointed at the way this 82 bike turned out. But nevertheless, it's good to see that David brings this old racehorse out for a blast every now and again, and it's nice to see these old motocrossers still being used on the racetrack. So I hope you've enjoyed this very brief and very critical look at David Loudon's 1982 KX420 Kawasaki. This video was brought to you in association with WorldSport, the world's #1 supplier for all your off-road and leisure sportswear. Just visit their online website for more information.